I never thought shoveling snow for a neighbor would lead to a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It started, as these things often do, with a quiet desire to just be left alone, and ended with lawyers, public humiliation, and the complete dismantling of a petty tyrant's little empire. My family has owned this land for 3 generations, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry newcomer with a binder full of rules threaten to take it away. My name is Jack. I own a small landscaping and property maintenance business, a trade I learned from my father, who learned it from his. Our home base, and my home, is a 5-acre plot that used to be the heart of a much larger farm. Back in the late 70s, my grandfather, a practical man who saw the writing on the wall for small-scale agriculture in our growing county, sold off most of the surrounding acreage to a developer. That land became Oak Creek Meadows, the suburban community that now encircled our original farmstead like a neat manicured donut around a slightly wilder, more rustic donut hole. I grew up here, running through fields that slowly became cul-de-sacs. The arrangement worked well for decades. The Homeowners Association was, for most of its life, a sleepy, benign entity. It existed mainly to manage the small park at the entrance and to make sure nobody painted their house a truly offensive color. The annual dues were minimal and the meetings were sparsely attended, mostly by retirees with time on their hands. We coexisted peacefully. The neighbors appreciated having a guy with a plow, a tractor, and a workshop full of tools right in the middle of the development, and I appreciated the quiet life. My business handled a lot of the lawns and snow removal in the neighborhood, but it was all done through friendly, informal agreements, neighbor to neighbor. That all changed the year Brenda moved in. She bought the big colonial on the corner, the one with the perfect lawn and the 3-car garage. From the moment her moving truck arrived, she carried herself with an air of unearned authority. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a haircut you could set your watch by, and a gaze that seemed to be constantly scanning for imperfections. She found them everywhere. Within 6 months, she had attended her first HOA meeting. Within a year, through a combination of relentless campaigning and the general apathy of everyone else, she was elected president of the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. The changes started small. First came the newsletter, a glossy, professionally printed affair that replaced the old mimeograph sheet. It was filled with friendly reminders about the covenants. Mailboxes had to be a specific model and color, black, from a specific supplier. Holiday decorations were to be removed no later than January 5th. Trash cans could not be visible from the street, except on collection day itself. Each new rule was a small tightening of the screw. People grumbled, but for the most part, they complied. It was easier than fighting. The fines for non-compliance were minor, $25 here, $50 there. It was nuisance money. I mostly ignored it. My property, the old farmstead, had always been a bit different. My mailbox was a sturdy, oversized metal box my grandfather had welded himself, set in a stone pillar. It wasn't black. My workshop, a large red barn, was definitely visible from the street. I had equipment, trailers, and piles of mulch and topsoil that were essential to my business. I wasn't part of the cookie-cutter aesthetic, and for 30 years, nobody had cared. I figured Brenda would eventually realize I was a special case and leave me be. I was wrong. The first direct interaction I had with her was over my grass. Not the grass on my lawn, which was immaculate, but the grass in the small pasture out back where my grandfather used to keep a couple of horses. I kept it mowed, but I let it grow a little longer, more like a hayfield. One Saturday afternoon, I saw her standing at the edge of my property line, staring. I walked over, wiping grease from my hands with a rag. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She looked at me, then gestured toward the field with a perfectly manicured hand. "Your grass," she said, her voice crisp. "It's in violation of Section 7, Paragraph B of the Community Standards. All turf areas must be maintained at a height not to exceed 4 inches. I blinked. "That's a pasture," I said. "It's not a lawn." "It is a grass-covered portion of your property, visible to your neighbors," she countered, as if reciting from a script. "The rules are quite clear. They exist to maintain property values for all of us." I just stared at her for a moment, a mix of disbelief and annoyance bubbling up. "Brenda," I said, deciding against the more formal misters. "I've lived here my entire life. That field has been a field for 50 years. Nobody has ever had a problem with it. "Well, I have a problem with it," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I am the president of the association, and it is my duty to enforce the rules for the benefit of the entire community. You'll receive a formal notice in the mail." She turned and walked back toward her perfect house, leaving me standing by my perfectly reasonable pasture. That was the first shot fired in what would become a long and ridiculous war. The notice arrived a few days later, a stiff, cream-colored envelope with the official Oak Creek Meadows logo embossed on the flap. It cited the rule she had quoted and informed me I had 14 days to comply or face a $100 fine, which would double every 30 days thereafter. I read it, laughed, and tossed it onto the pile of junk mail on my kitchen counter. I had real work to do. I had contracts to fulfill, equipment to maintain, and a business to run. I didn't have time for this nonsense. That winter, the real trouble began. The forecasters called it a generational storm, and for once, they weren't exaggerating. It started snowing on a Thursday afternoon and didn't stop for 36 hours. When we woke up on Saturday morning, the world was buried under nearly 3 feet of silent white powder. It was beautiful, but it was also a crisis. The county plows wouldn't get to our side roads for days. People were trapped. For me, a storm like this was money, but it was also a responsibility. My phone started ringing at dawn. My commercial clients needed their lots cleared. But before I headed out, I did what my father and grandfather always did. I fired up my big Ford F350, the one with the heavy-duty commercial plow in the front, and got to work at home. I cleared my long driveway first, then I turned down our little street. My immediate neighbor to the south was George, a retired history professor in his late 70s. He was a good man who had been a friend of my grandfather's. I cleared his driveway in 5 minutes. Next was the Miller family, a young couple with 2 small kids. I did theirs too. Then I got to Mr. Gable's house. She was 85 years old and lived alone. Her late husband had been my dad's best friend. There was no question I was going to plow her out. It wasn't about business. It was about being a neighbor. I was just finishing the last pass on her driveway, pushing the snow into a neat pile at the edge of her yard, when I saw a figure trudging through the deep snow across the street. It was Brenda. She was wearing a ridiculously expensive-looking ski jacket, and her face was pinched with fury. She stopped at the end of Mr. Gable's driveway, blocking my exit. I put the truck in park and lowered the driver's side window, letting in a blast of cold air. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Looks like I'm plowing snow," I said, gesturing with my head toward the cleared driveway. "What does it look like to you?" Sarcasm was lost on her. "You are operating a commercial vehicle within the residential zone," she snapped. "That is a direct violation of Covenant 12, paragraph F. No commercial vehicles, including but not limited to trucks, trailers, or heavy equipment, shall be operated or parked within the community, except for the purposes of direct, pre-approved contracted services with the association or a resident." She had the rule memorized. Of course she did. I sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. "Brenda, I'm helping my neighbors. Mr. Gable is 85. She can't shovel 3 feet of snow. I'm not charging anyone for this." "That is irrelevant," she shot back. "A rule is a rule. The association has an exclusive contract for snow removal to ensure a uniform standard of service." I almost laughed. The exclusive contract was with a company that was notoriously unreliable. They used small, inadequate plows and wouldn't show up until the snow had stopped for at least 12 hours. They wouldn't be here for another day, at least. "Their uniform standard is leaving everyone trapped in their homes," I said. "I'm making it so an ambulance could get to Mr. Gable if it needed to. Do you have a problem with that?" "My problem," she said, stepping closer and placing a gloved hand on my truck's fender, "is with your flagrant disregard for the rules that everyone else is expected to follow. This is not some lawless backwater. This is a covenanted community. You will cease this activity immediately. You will remove your vehicle, and you will be receiving a formal notice for this violation. The fine is $500. I stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was breathtaking. We were in the middle of a state of emergency, and she was out here quoting bylaws and handing out imaginary fines. "You want me to stop helping an elderly woman who is snowed in?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you're telling me to do?" "I am telling you to follow the rules," she said, her chin jutting out. "There are no exceptions." I shook my head slowly, pulled the gear shifter into drive, and gave her a look that I hoped conveyed the entirety of my contempt. "Send me the letter," I said. I carefully maneuvered the big truck around her and drove off to clear the rest of the street. I could feel her eyes burning into the back of my cab the entire way. The war was no longer a cold one. The letter arrived a week later, along with another one for the pasture I still hadn't mowed to her satisfaction. The fine for the plowing was, as promised, $500. The fine for the grass had now doubled to $200. Total owed $700. I shredded them both. A few days after that, I got a call from Mrs. Gable. Her voice was trembling. "Jack, dear, I got a strange letter from that woman, Brenda," she said. "It says I'm being fined $100 for employing an unlicensed and unapproved contractor to clear my snow." A hot, white rage filled my chest. This was a new low, targeting an old woman to get at me. "Mrs. Gable, you didn't employ me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I did that for free, as a neighbor. You don't owe her a penny. Just ignore it. I'll handle this." I hung up the phone and stomped over to Brenda's house. I didn't bother with the perfectly paved walkway. I walked right across her chemically treated lawn and pounded on her front door. She opened it, a look of smug triumph on her face that quickly faded when she saw the expression on mine. "You set a fine to Mrs. Gable?" I demanded, not waiting for pleasantries. "She violated the covenants," Brenda said, attempting to regain her composure. "The rules apply to everyone." "She's an 85-year-old widow. You're harassing her because you have a problem with me. That's cowardly, Brenda, even for you." "I will not be spoken to this way on my own property," she said, trying to close the door. I put my hand on it, stopping it. "You're going to rescind that fine," I said, my voice low. "You're going to leave her alone. This is between you and me." "Or what?" she sneered. "You'll run me over with your illegal truck? Everything I am doing is perfectly legal and by the book. You are the one breaking the law. Now get off my property before I call the police." She managed to shove the door closed, and I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood there for a long moment, my fists clenched, realizing that reason and decency were not going to work. She was a bully who hid behind a rulebook, and the only way to beat a bully like that was to find a bigger rulebook. The next month was a cascade of paper. Every week a new envelope from the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. The fines were compounding. The original $700 was now $1,400, then $2,800. I was getting fined for things I couldn't even comprehend. Improperly parked equipment for a trailer that was on my own property, 100 yards from the road. Unapproved agricultural activity for my vegetable garden. Structural non-compliance for my grandfather's barn. It was absurd. It was harassment, plain and simple. The conflict started affecting more than just me and Mrs. Gable. Brenda's chosen snow removal company, the one with the exclusive contract, did a terrible job after the big storm. They plowed the main loop of the neighborhood, but left the cul-de-sacs and smaller side streets barely passable. For days, the mail carrier refused to deliver to a dozen homes because the road was too treacherous. A school bus got stuck trying to navigate an icy turn. Parents were furious. But when they complained at the next HOA meeting, Brenda defended the company vigorously, stating that they had fulfilled the terms of their contract and that the weather had been unprecedented. Publicly, most of my neighbors kept their heads down. They didn't want to get on Brenda's bad side. But privately, the tide was turning. People would stop me at the grocery store or the post office. "This is crazy, Jack," they'd mutter. "She's out of control." George, my retired professor neighbor, would bring me clippings from the local paper about HOA overreach in other communities. "There are patterns to this kind of tyranny, my boy," he'd say, peering over his spectacles. "It always ends badly for the tyrant." The breaking point for me came in early April. I received a certified letter. Inside was a bill totaling over $10,000 in accumulated fines and late fees. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter stated that if the amount was not paid in full within 30 days, the HOA board had voted to place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. They were threatening to take my home, my family's land, the place my grandfather had built with his own hands. My blood ran cold. This had gone from a ridiculous feud to a genuine threat. This woman was actually trying to steal my property over the height of my grass and the fact that I'd helped an old lady. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter shaking slightly in my hand. This wasn't about money, it was about principle. It was about my heritage. I knew then that I had to stop being reactive and start fighting back, strategically. My first thought was of my grandfather. He had been a shrewd, careful man. He trusted people, but he also understood human nature. He always said, "Hope for the best, but have a lawyer write up the paperwork." As I sat there, stewing, a memory surfaced. A dusty box of his old papers in the attic. I hadn't looked in it for years. It was full of old deeds, tax records, and business correspondence. Maybe, just maybe, there was something in there. That night, I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cedar. In the corner, under a canvas tarp, was a heavy cardboard box with "Farm Business" scrawled on the side in my grandfather's handwriting. I dragged it into the light and opened it. Inside were meticulously organized files, and in a folder labeled "Property Sale, Oak Creek Dev," I found what I was looking for. But I also found something else, a business card, faded and yellowed with age. Abernathy & Sons, attorneys at law. Mr. Arthur Abernathy, my grandfather's lawyer. The man who had structured the land deal. I knew he had to be long retired, probably in his 90s if he was even still around. But it was a lead. The next morning, I called the number. It was disconnected. I did some searching online and found a listing for a Jedediah Abernathy, Esquire, in the city. The address was for a modern high-rise law firm. It had to be the Sons from the old shingle. I called the number and asked to speak with him. His secretary was skeptical, but when I mentioned my name and the Oak Creek land deal from the 70s, she put me through. "Mr. Abernathy," I began, "my name is Jack, and my grandfather was a client of your father's. His name was William." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Good heavens," a warm, gravelly voice said. "William, of course, a fine man. Built a barn that could survive the apocalypse. My father spoke of him often. What can I do for you, son?" I explained the whole sordid story. The new HOA president, the absurd fines, the escalating harassment, and finally, the threat of foreclosure. Jedediah listened patiently, letting out a low whistle every now and then. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. "A lien on the original farmstead parcel," he said finally, a note of something I couldn't quite identify, amusement, excitement, in his voice. "Oh, she has made a grave tactical error, a very grave error indeed." "What do you mean?" I asked. "My father," he explained, "was as careful as your grandfather. When they drew up that land sale, they were dealing with a developer who wanted to slap a homeowners association on everything. William wanted no part of that, not for the land he was keeping. He wanted to be left alone to run his business and live his life. So, my father baked something into the original deed, something special." My heart started to beat a little faster. "Something special?" "Jack," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I think it's time you and I had a meeting. Can you bring all of your grandfather's paperwork on the sale? Especially the title and the deed. I have a copy in our archives, but I'd love to see the original. And in the meantime, start digging into this HOA. Get their bylaws, their meeting minutes, their budget, especially their budget. Bullies like this Brenda are often hiding more than just a lust for power." Hope. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of hope. I wasn't just a guy with a plow truck against a bureaucracy anymore. I had an ally. And it sounded like my grandfather, from 30 years in the grave, had left me a secret weapon. My investigation began in earnest. Getting the HOA documents was surprisingly easy. According to state law, they had to make them available to any homeowner. I sent a formal, written request. Brenda couldn't deny it, though the packet I received a week later was clearly assembled with disdain. It was a thick stack of papers containing the bylaws, the current budget, and the minutes from the last 5 years of meetings. I spread them out on my dining room table, feeling like an archaeologist unearthing a lost civilization. A very, very petty civilization. The bylaws were a masterpiece of convoluted legalese, full of the kind of restrictions Brenda so enjoyed quoting. But it was the budget that caught my eye. As Jedediah had predicted, something was off. The line item for grounds maintenance and snow removal was astronomically high. It had nearly tripled in the 2 years since Brenda had taken over. The contractor was listed as Apex Property Solutions, LLC. I did a quick online search. The company was registered just 2 years ago. The registered agent? A man named Robert Peterson. The address listed was in the next town over. It didn't mean anything to me at first. Then I turned to the meeting minutes. They were mostly dry accounts of motions and votes. A motion to approve the new mailbox standard. A motion to censure a homeowner for a discolored fence. But as I read through the minutes from Brenda's first year as president, I found the vote to award the new snow removal contract. The minutes noted that 3 bids were received, and the board, led by Brenda, voted to award the contract to Apex Property Solutions, despite it being the highest bid. The justification was superior service and equipment. A blatant lie, as the entire neighborhood could attest. The name Robert Peterson still bothered me. It felt familiar. I thought back. Brenda had hosted a big summer barbecue a year ago, a self-congratulatory community event. I had avoided it, but I remembered seeing a loud, beefy guy manning the grill. Brenda had introduced him as her brother-in-law, her sister's husband. What was his name? Bob Peterson. My blood went cold again, but this time it was with the thrill of discovery. Apex Property Solutions was her brother-in-law's company. She had steered a grossly inflated, exclusive contract to her own family. This wasn't just petty tyranny anymore. This was fraud. I immediately called Jedediah Abernathy and told him what I'd found. He chuckled. "It's the classic small-time dictator's playbook," he said. "Power is the goal, but a little graft on the side is the perk. This is good, Jack. This is very good. It gives us leverage beyond the deed. Now, have you found that original deed yet?" I had. It was in a long, stiff envelope, the paper thick and fibrous. I had scanned it and sent it to him, but he wanted to see the physical document. I drove into the city the next day for our meeting. His office was the polar opposite of his father's old shingle. It was on the 40th floor of a glass and steel tower with a view that stretched for miles. Jedediah himself was in his late 60s, tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair and the same sharp, intelligent eyes I imagined his father had. He greeted me with a firm handshake and led me to a conference room. He had my scanned copy of the deed on a large screen. "Jack, look at this," he said, pointing to a dense paragraph on the second page. It was titled, "Covenant of Exemption for Retained Parcel." My father was a poet with legal jargon, Jedediah said with a grin. He read it aloud, translating the legalese into plain English as he went. "The 5-acre parcel, hereinafter referred to as the farmstead, retained by the grantor, William, shall be perpetually and irrevocably exempt from any and all covenants, conditions, restrictions, bylaws, fees, dues, or assessments of any future homeowners association or similar governing body formed by the grantee or its successors." He goes on, but you get the gist. "Jack, the Oak Creek Meadows HOA has as much legal authority over your property as the Queen of England. None. Zero. Zip." I sank into a leather chair, a slow grin spreading across my face. "So all of it, the fines, the letters, the threats, it's all bogus." "Worse than bogus," Jedediah said, his expression turning serious. "It's fraudulent. They have been asserting an authority they do not possess. The moment they filed that lien, or even threatened to, they crossed a line from civil harassment into potentially criminal territory. And now that we know about the contract with her brother-in-law, we have a clear motive. She's not just a control freak, she's a crook, and you are a threat to her little scheme. By refusing to comply, you're setting a bad example. If people see you getting away with it, they might start questioning other things, like why their dues tripled and the snow removal got worse. The pieces all clicked into place. My defiance wasn't just an insult to her authority, it was a danger to her illegal income stream. She wasn't just trying to make me mow my pasture, she was trying to eliminate me. Foreclosing on my property would get rid of the biggest and most visible dissenter, and the HOA, which she controlled, would get a valuable piece of land to sell, the profits of which she could probably find a way to skim. "So what do we do now?" I asked, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Jedediah leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We could just send them a cease and desist letter," he said. "But bullies like Brenda don't respond to quiet warnings. They double down. They call it a bluff. No, I think we need a more public forum." He glanced at the calendar on his desk. "You said she was planning to hold a meeting to vote on the foreclosure." "That's what the letter said," I confirmed. "Perfect," he said, a predatory glint in his eye. "We will let her proceed. We will let her walk right into the trap she set for herself. You will get a notice for this meeting. When you do, send it to me. And tell your neighbors, tell George, tell Mr. Gable, tell the young family with the kids. Tell them to come. Tell them it's going to be a show." The strategy had shifted. I was no longer on the defensive, waiting for the next threatening letter to arrive. I was on the attack. Armed with the truth of my grandfather's foresight and the evidence of Brenda's corruption, I was ready to bring the fight to her. I spent the next 2 weeks laying the groundwork. I spoke quietly with George, who was a respected voice in the community. I showed him the deed and the budget documents. His academic calm gave way to righteous fury. "This is kleptocracy in miniature," he declared, his fist hitting his dining room table. "She's using our money to enrich her family. This is unacceptable." He promised to rally the other retirees, the ones who had the time and the inclination to see this through. I visited Mr. Gable and explained the situation. I assured her that the fine she had received was not only invalid, but malicious. The relief on her face was immense. She promised she would be at the meeting, even if she had to get a ride. The word started to spread, quietly, through back fences and over phone calls. A sense of anticipation was building in Oak Creek Meadows. Something was about to happen. The official notice for the special meeting on covenant enforcement arrived as expected. It was scheduled for a Tuesday night in the rented community room of the local library. The agenda was simple: discussion and vote on remedial action for property at Lot 1, followed by an address from the president. Lot 1, that was me. They had stripped my home of its name and reduced it to a number on a plat map. I forwarded the notice to Jedediah with a simple message: "It's time." The night of the meeting, the library's community room was packed. Normally, these meetings drew a dozen people at most. Tonight, there were over 100. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the back and side walls. I saw George and a contingent of his fellow retirees in the front row. I saw Mr. Gable sitting next to the Miller family. I saw faces I hadn't seen at an HOA function in years. They were all here. The community, once apathetic, was awake and watching. I took a seat in the back, wanting to observe. Brenda and her 2 cronies on the board, a timid man named Frank and a woman who mirrored Brenda's every expression, sat at a long table at the front of the room. Brenda looked out at the unexpectedly large crowd, a flicker of unease crossing her face before being replaced by a mask of stern authority. She clearly interpreted the crowd as a sign of her own importance, a public gathering to witness her triumph. She banged a small gavel on the table. "This special meeting of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association will now come to order," she announced, her voice amplified by a small microphone. She went through the perfunctory opening remarks, her tone dripping with self-importance. Then she got to the main event. "As you all know," she began, "our community is governed by covenants that we all agree to when we purchase our homes. These rules are not arbitrary. They are the bedrock of our shared property values and our quality of life. They ensure that Oak Creek Meadows remains a desirable and beautiful place to live. But these rules are meaningless if they are not enforced. For months, one homeowner has flagrantly, repeatedly, and arrogantly violated our community standards." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the room. The property at Lot 1, she continued, has been in a state of continuous violation. Unapproved vehicles, improper land use, non-compliant structures. We have sent notices, we have issued fines, we have made every reasonable effort to bring this property into compliance. But the owner has refused. The fines now total over $12,000, and they remain unpaid. This defiance cannot be allowed to stand. It is a threat to the very integrity of our association. She let that hang in the air. Therefore, she said, her voice turning hard, the board has been left with no choice. Tonight, we will vote on a resolution to authorize our legal counsel to place a foreclosure lien on Lot 1 to recover the unpaid fines and bring this unfortunate chapter to a close. I now move that we vote on this resolution. Frank, the timid board member, seconded the motion in a mumble. Brenda looked out at the crowd, a smug smile on her face. Is there any discussion before the vote? She asked, a rhetorical question. She didn't expect any. That was the cue. From the back of the room, a calm, authoritative voice spoke up. I believe I have a point of discussion. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Jedediah Abernathy. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked like he owned the building. He walked slowly and deliberately to the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. Brenda stared at him, confused. Excuse me, sir, she said, her authority wavering for the first time. This is a meeting for homeowners of Oak Creek Meadows. I am here as legal counsel for Mr. Jack, the owner of the property you so clinically refer to as Lot 1, Jedediah said, his voice filling the room without the aid of a microphone. He placed his briefcase on the table and opened it. And I am here to inform you, Madam President, that this entire proceeding is a sham. Brenda's face flushed a deep red. I beg your pardon. Who do you think you are? I am Jedediah Abernathy, he said simply. My father, Arthur Abernathy, was the attorney who drafted the original sales agreement for the land that constitutes Oak Creek Meadows. And in doing so, he and the property's original owner, Mr. William, Jack's grandfather, included a very specific, very binding, and very permanent clause. He pulled a thick yellow document from his briefcase. It was the original deed. He held it up for all to see. This, Madam President, is the founding document of your community, and it contains a covenant of exemption. It explicitly and irrevocably states that the original 5-acre farmstead is not, and never can be, subject to any rules, fees, or authority of your association. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Brenda's jaw dropped. That's not possible, she stammered. That's a fake. It is a legally recorded deed, filed with the county in 1978, Jedediah countered, his voice like ice. He placed the document on the table in front of her. Which means every fine you have issued to my client is fraudulent, every warning letter is harassment, and this attempt to file a foreclosure lien, he paused, letting his words sink in, is attempted theft, a felony. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions. Brenda looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her face had gone from red to a pasty white. Her authority, which she had wielded like a weapon for 2 years, had crumbled to dust in 30 seconds. But that's not all, Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent again. He pulled another set of documents from his briefcase, the HOA budget, and the printouts about Apex Property Solutions. My client, in defending himself against your illegal persecution, did a little research. He was curious why his neighbors were paying triple the price for half the snow removal service they used to get. He held up the printout. He discovered that the exclusive, non-competitive, and wildly overpriced contract for snow removal was awarded to a company named Apex Property Solutions. A company formed just 2 years ago. A company, as it turns out, owned and operated by a Mr. Robert Peterson. Jedediah paused and looked directly at Brenda. Would you care to tell the community, who has been paying for this contract with their dues, what your relationship is to Mr. Robert Peterson? Brenda just stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She had no answer. but George, from the front row, did. "He's her brother-in-law," he shouted. "We all saw him at her barbecue." The chaos that followed was absolute. The veneer of polite suburban order was stripped away, revealing the raw anger of people who realized they'd been cheated. Accusations flew from every corner of the room. "Thief!" someone yelled. "Fraud!" screamed another. Brenda's two board members looked horrified, shrinking away from her as if she were radioactive. Brenda, finally finding her voice, banged the gavel uselessly. "This is slander! These are lies! This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked, scrambling to gather her papers. "I don't think so," Jedediah said calmly. Just then, two uniformed police officers appeared in the doorway at the back of the room. A neighbor, whom I'd tipped off earlier in the day, had made the call as soon as Jedediah presented the evidence of fraud. They made their way through the parting crowd. The sight of the uniforms brought a new, more serious silence to the room. One of the officers approached the front table. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "we've received a credible report of fraud and embezzlement concerning the finances of this association. We're going to need you to stay here and answer a few questions." Brenda's collapse was total. The mask of the tyrant fell away, revealing a panicked, cornered woman. She started to cry, not tears of remorse, but tears of rage and self-pity. "He's the one who broke the rules," she wailed, pointing a trembling finger at me, still sitting in the back. "He's the one who started all this." The officer gave me a brief, uninterested glance, then turned back to her. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." The downfall was swift, public, and complete. As they escorted a sputtering, weeping Brenda out of the library, the community she had tried to rule with an iron fist watched in stunned silence, which then slowly turned into a smattering of applause. The war was over. I had won. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal and administrative cleanup. The State Attorney General's office launched a full investigation into the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. Brenda's scheme was revealed to be even more brazen than we had uncovered. She had been approving fake invoices from her brother-in-law's company for work that was never done, and they had been splitting the profits. It amounted to over $80,000 stolen from the community's reserve fund over 2 years. Brenda was charged with multiple felonies, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Her brother-in-law was charged as well. Faced with the mountain of evidence Jedediah and I had provided, plus the HOA's own financial records, they both took plea deals rather than face a jury. Brenda was sentenced to 18 months in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution. Her perfect colonial house went up for sale to cover her legal fees and the restitution payments. She was ruined, financially and socially. For my part, all actions against me were, of course, immediately dropped. The HOA, under temporary management appointed by the state, sent me a formal letter of apology. More importantly, they sent me a check. Jedediah had argued that since the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property, every dollar in dues my family had ever paid since 1978 was collected improperly. After some negotiation, they agreed to refund the entire amount with interest. It was a substantial sum, enough to buy a brand new skid steer for my business. My grandfather, I thought, would have appreciated the irony. With Brenda gone, a new spirit took hold in Oak Creek Meadows. The community, galvanized by the fight, was no longer apathetic. George, the retired professor, was unanimously elected as the new HOA president at a special election. His first act was to lead a committee to completely rewrite the bylaws. They threw out hundreds of pages of petty, restrictive rules. The new covenants were simple, based on common sense and mutual respect. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. The infamous snow removal contract was terminated. The new board put the contract out for a proper, transparent bidding process. My company submitted a bid, and it was one of 3. We didn't get the exclusive contract. The board wisely decided to award it to 2 different local companies to ensure competition and reliability. But I was hired by dozens of my neighbors directly, including George and Mr. Gable, under the new, simplified rules that allowed homeowners to hire whomever they pleased. Life in the neighborhood returned to a state of quiet, neighborly cooperation, but it was better than before. People talked to each other more. There were community barbecues, real ones, not the staged events Brenda used to host. The oppressive atmosphere of judgment was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and relief. My reputation in the neighborhood was transformed. I was no longer just the guy with the tractor. I was the guy who had stood up to the bully and won. People would wave as I drove my truck down the street. A friendly, genuine wave, not the suspicious glare I had grown used to. About 2 years after the big showdown, I was in the local grocery store, in the produce section, when I saw her. It was Brenda. I almost didn't recognize her. The severe haircut was gone, replaced by limp, unstyled hair. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a worn-out sweatsuit. She looked tired and diminished. She was staring at a display of avocados with a vacant expression. Our eyes met for a brief second. A flash of recognition, of shame, of old anger passed through her gaze. She quickly looked down at her cart, which contained a few generic brand items, and pushed it hurriedly down the next aisle, away from me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel the triumphant satisfaction I might have expected. I just felt a quiet sense of pity. Her little kingdom was gone, her power had evaporated, and all that was left was this sad, defeated person in a grocery store. She had built her identity on controlling others, and when that was taken away, she had nothing left. As I look back on that whole ridiculous chapter of my life, the lesson that sticks with me is one my grandfather tried to teach me long ago. It's about the difference between rules and respect. Brenda was obsessed with rules, but she had no respect for the people she was supposed to be serving. She saw the community not as a collection of neighbors, but as a set of properties to be kept in line. A community isn't built on covenants and fines. It's built on trust, on helping an old woman clear her driveway after a snowstorm, on knowing your neighbors' names, on standing together against someone who tries to tear that apart for their own selfish gain. The other day, we had another big snow. Not as bad as the generational storm, but enough to close schools for a day. I woke up early, fired up the old Ford plow truck, and cleared my driveway. Then I drove down the street and cleared George's driveway. Then the Millers. Then I made my way to Mr. Gable's house. As I was finishing up, her front door opened. She came out, bundled in a thick coat, holding a thermos. She walked carefully down the path I had just cleared. "Jack, you're a lifesaver," she said, her smile warm. "I made you some coffee, the least I can do." I shut down the truck and took the thermos from her. The steam rose into the cold morning air, smelling rich and warm. We stood there for a moment, looking at the quiet, snow-covered street. The houses were peaceful. The neighborhood was at peace. "It's no trouble, Mr. Gable," I said, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "It's what neighbors do." And I went back to work, a free man on my own land, in a community we had taken back together. The silence was broken only by the scrape of my plow on the pavement, a sound of order and service, not of oppression. It was a good sound.